The city was alive, but Evelyn Carter felt dead inside. The rain hammered against her windshield as she navigated the slick streets of Manhattan, her mind heavy with the weight of a grueling day at the law firm. Her knuckles gripped the steering wheel too tightly, her thoughts tangled in a web of deadlines and client demands. She hadn't meant to speed. She never did, but the pressure had been relentless, and now it pushed her foot harder on the gas pedal. The streetlights blurred through the downpour like streaks of neon paint, casting an eerie glow over the pavement. Pedestrians darted across intersections, umbrellas bobbing like misplaced buoys in a stormy sea. Evelyn barely registered them, her focus fractured between the road ahead and the endless mental checklist scrolling through her mind. And then it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, a pedestrian stepping off the curb against the light. Evelyn's heart lurched as she slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact was sickening, a dull thud that reverberated through the car and into her very soul. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world outside dissolved into silence except for the rhythmic patter of rain on metal. Then came the scream, a raw, piercing sound that clawed its way into Evelyn's ears and lodged itself there, refusing to leave. She sat frozen, staring through the cracked windshield at the crumpled form lying motionless on the wet asphalt. Panic surged through her veins, hot and suffocating. What had she done? The rational part of her brain screamed to call for help, to get out of the car and check if the person was alive. But fear, a primal, animalistic terror, took hold instead. If she stayed, her life would unravel. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked so hard for would be destroyed. With trembling hands, she shifted the car into gear and sped away, leaving behind only skid marks and shattered glass. As Evelyn drove, her vision blurred not just from the rain but from tears she refused to acknowledge. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, each one feeling heavier than the last. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing police lights or angry bystanders chasing after her. Instead, something else caught her eye. A small figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk where the accident had occurred. It was a boy no older than 10, his face pale and wide-eyed beneath the brim of a soaked baseball cap. He stared directly at her car, his expression unreadable yet hauntingly accusatory. Their eyes locked for what felt like an eternity before he turned and bolted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he'd appeared. Evelyn's stomach churned. Had he seen her face? Did he know who she was? For the rest of the drive home, the image of the boy lingered in her mind, gnawing at her already frayed nerves. Who was he? Why had he been there? Questions swirled relentlessly, feeding her growing paranoia. By the time she pulled into her parking garage, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn off the ignition. Over the next few days, Evelyn tried and failed to push the memory of the accident out of her mind. Sleep eluded her, plagued by nightmares of the screaming victim and the boy's unblinking gaze. During waking hours, she jumped at every unexpected noise, convinced someone was coming for her. Yet nothing prepared her for the moment when she first saw him again. It was late afternoon, and she was walking back to her apartment after grabbing coffee. As she rounded the corner, she spotted him. The same boy, standing silently across the street. His head tilted slightly as he watched her, his presence both ghostly and deliberate. This time, Evelyn couldn't ignore him. She crossed the street, her pulse racing, and approached cautiously. "Hey!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. He simply stared at her with those unervingly blank eyes before turning and running away once more. It wasn't until later that evening, while scrolling through local news reports about the hit-and-run victim, that Evelyn discovered his identity. His name was Ethan Bennett, Sophie Bennett's younger brother. According to the article, Ethan had been mute since witnessing the accident, a trauma-induced condition that left him unable to speak. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random child who'd stumbled upon the scene. He was Sophie's brother, and he knew exactly what she'd done, or at least suspected it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, accusing and silent. Was he waiting for her to confess? Or worse, plotting revenge? Evelyn woke to the sound of rain tapping against her bedroom window, a cruel echo of that fateful night. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope slipped under her door, a plain white rectangle with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "I know what you did." Her breath hitched. Who could have sent this? She scanned the note again, searching for any clue. A smudge, a fingerprint, but found nothing. It wasn't signed. Yet its brevity made it all the more menacing. Evelyn crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash, but the message lingered in her mind like an unshakable shadow. Over the next few days, more notes arrived, each one escalating in tone. "You can't hide forever," read the second. By the third, the writer had grown bolder. "Sophie remembers more than you think." Evelyn's paranoia spiraled. Was it Ethan, or someone else entirely? Whoever they were, they knew enough to destroy her. Desperate for guidance, Evelyn confided in her closest friend at work, Claire Harper, during a late-night coffee run. Claire had always been her rock, a steady presence amidst the chaos of their high-pressure law firm. Evelyn didn't reveal everything, only vague hints about feeling complicit in something terrible. Claire listened intently, offering comforting platitudes about guilt being a natural human emotion. But 2 days later, Evelyn overheard Claire speaking to an investigator in hushed tones near the office water cooler. "And she mentioned something about responsibility," Claire said, her voice low but unmistakable. "She's acting strange lately, jumpy, distracted. I think she knows more than she's letting on." Evelyn felt the floor drop out from beneath her. How could Claire betray her like this? They'd shared countless lunches, vented about impossible clients, even cried together after particularly grueling cases. But now, Evelyn saw the truth. Claire wasn't her ally. She was a liability. Trust shattered. Evelyn retreated further into herself, isolating not just from Claire but from everyone around her. Every conversation became suspect, every glance laden with accusation. Determined to confront her fears head-on, Evelyn arranged a clandestine visit to Sophie Bennett's hospital room. Sophie lay pale and fragile in her bed, her once vibrant eyes clouded with confusion. When Evelyn entered, Sophie stirred slightly, her gaze flickering toward the intruder. For a moment, Evelyn considered turning back. What was she hoping to achieve here? Forgiveness? Absolution? Neither seemed possible. But then Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't just you." The words hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. Before she could respond, Sophie's body convulsed violently, her limbs jerking as if seized by an invisible force. Alarms blared, nurses rushed in, and Evelyn fled the room, heart pounding. The cryptic warning replayed in her mind endlessly. What did Sophie mean? If Evelyn hadn't acted alone, who else was involved? And why couldn't Sophie remember? The encounter left Evelyn shaken but resolute. She needed answers, and fast. Liam Harper had become both a lifeline and a mystery to Evelyn. His initial hostility toward her had softened into something resembling camaraderie, though his motives remained opaque. He claimed to want justice for Sophie, yet there were moments when Evelyn caught glimpses of something darker beneath his polished exterior. One evening, as they sat in a dimly lit diner discussing their next steps, Evelyn excused herself to use the restroom. On her way back, She paused outside the booth where Liam sat, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was tense, almost frantic. "I need one last piece of evidence," he muttered. "Then we'll have everything we need to take her down." Evelyn froze, her blood running cold. Take her down? Was Liam working against her all along? Had he been manipulating her trust to gather information? Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to remain calm. Returning to the table, she smiled tightly and pretended not to have heard anything. Inside, however, doubt gnawed at her resolve. Could she trust anyone? Not even Liam? The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within Evelyn as she stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the police precinct. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted the events of that fateful night. The rain-soaked streets, the figure stepping into her path, the sickening impact, and her cowardly flight. Each word felt like a shard of glass tearing through her chest, but she forced herself to continue. Confessing was supposed to bring closure, wasn't it? Yet, as the officers scribbled notes and exchanged knowing glances, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her confession was interrupted by the sudden burst of the door flying open. Liam strode in, his face taut with urgency, but he wasn't alone. Behind him loomed a shadowy figure clad in a black hoodie, their features obscured by a grotesque mask resembling a distorted human face. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Who was this person? And why had Liam brought them here? "This isn't what it looks like," Liam began, his voice strained. But before he could elaborate, the masked figure stepped forward, pulling off the disguise with deliberate slowness. Beneath the mask was a man Evelyn vaguely recognized. A colleague from her law firm, someone she'd passed in the hallway countless times without giving a second thought. His name was Victor Kane, though his identity mattered less than the venomous smirk twisting his lips. "You thought you were the only guilty one?" Victor sneered, his gaze locking onto Evelyn. "You hit Sophie, sure. But I'm the reason she ended up in that hospital bed." He revealed himself as the driver of the second car, the one Sophie had glimpsed speeding away. According to Victor, he and Liam had been working together all along, orchestrating a cover-up scheme to protect themselves while pinning the blame squarely on Evelyn. Before Evelyn could process the betrayal, chaos erupted. Officers shouted orders, grabbing for Victor, who bolted toward the exit. In the commotion, Liam hesitated, his eyes meeting Evelyn's for a fleeting moment. There was no apology in his gaze, only resignation. Then he too disappeared into the fray, leaving Evelyn alone in the wreckage of shattered trust. As the dust settled, Evelyn found herself sitting across from Sophie Bennett once more. This time, Sophie was stronger, her recovery progressing steadily. Evelyn had hoped to find some semblance of peace in this meeting, to perhaps earn forgiveness or understanding. Instead, Sophie delivered a bombshell that shattered any illusion of redemption. "I remember everything now," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. She described the accident in vivid detail. 2 cars racing down the street, tires screeching, headlights blinding. One car struck her, the one driven by Evelyn. But another sped past mere seconds later, its presence undeniable. When pressed, Sophie identified Liam as the driver of the second vehicle. Evelyn's world tilted. All this time, she'd believed herself the sole perpetrator, the architect of Sophie's suffering. Now, she realized she'd been a pawn in a much larger game, a web of deceit woven by those she'd trusted most. Liam's manipulation cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving her hollow and betrayed. After hours of questioning, Evelyn finally emerged from the precinct, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe she might be free, not legally perhaps, but emotionally. She'd confessed her sins, exposed the truth, and faced the consequences. Surely that counted for something. But as she stepped onto the rain-slicked sidewalk, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A single text message appeared on the screen, sent from an unknown number. "We're not done yet." The words sent a chill coursing through her veins. Before she could react, movement caught her eye across the street. It was Ethan, Sophie's mute brother, standing motionless beneath a flickering street lamp. In his hands, he held up a drawing, a crude yet unmistakable depiction of the accident scene. At the center of the image was Evelyn's car, circled in red, with an arrow pointing directly at her. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan's wide, unblinking eyes locked onto hers, accusatory and unwavering. Around them, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the silent exchange unfolding between predator and prey. As the camera panned in on Evelyn's horrified expression, the screen faded to black, leaving readers suspended in a liminal space of dread and uncertainty.